Greetings, loyal subjects of the Imperium of Man. I am Librarian Elias of the Adeptus Astartes. I am creating a series of recordings with the intent of educating the general populace of the dangers of the galaxy. All of this information comes from the Lexicanum, provided to me by the Adeptus Mechanicus. I will be reading verbatim from their archives. This recording will cover one of the few allies the Imperium has. Primarch of the 18th Legion, Vulkan. Vulkan was one of the 20 Primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind to lead his great crusade and reunite the scattered peoples of humanity. Vulkan's Space Marine Legion was renamed the Salamanders in his honor. As with all the Primarchs, Vulkan inherited an aspect of his father. However, for him, this was the unique ability of being perpetual, making him essentially immortal. Vulkan was able to regenerate fully from any injury, including a death that would vaporize him completely. This ability was unknown to him until the Horus Heresy, and during the Great Crusade, he gained a reputation for his empathy towards average humans, as well as his craftsmanship abilities. Like his brother Primarchs, Vulkan has a characteristic that sets him apart: his patience and humanity. Though possibly gene-bred into his temperament, this was also likely influenced by his upbringing in a small village. He demonstrates this characteristic many times on 1544. Vulkan constantly gives commands in the heat of battle that cause the least amount of casualties to the native population, against the advice of Manus and even his own men. It is spoken of among his brothers that Vulkan is the most suited to their father's vision of a peaceful Imperium. Vulkan is also the largest and physically strongest of all the Primarchs. He is said to be as tall in his power armor as Horus is in his own, much larger Terminator armor, and is capable of overturning Space Marine battle tanks with his bare hands. During sparring matches with his brother Primarchs, Vulkan deliberately held back out of fear of hurting them. He, much like the rest of his legion, also possesses coal-like skin with fiery red eyes. When the Primarchs was scattered from the Emperor's laboratory, Vulkan arrived on the planet Nocturne during the time of trial as an infant and was soon taken in by the blacksmith, Nabel. Nabel raised Vulkan, naming him after the first king of the Salamanders, and the young Primarch considered him his father. The people of his hometown were astounded by this child, for within the space of 3 years, he was stronger and bigger than any man in his town. In addition to his massive physical size, he was the quickest mind and the greatest blacksmith anyone knew of. Indeed, it was not long before Vulkan himself was teaching forging techniques to the people that had not yet been discovered. The people of Nocturne were frequently raided by the Dark Eldar. They were so used to this common occurrence that each person in town had developed their own hiding place to avoid capture. When the Dark Eldar raided again in Vulkan's 4th year on Nocturne, the Primarch refused to hide and instead stood out in the center of the settlement, his 2 smithing hammers crossed over his shoulders. The people of Vulkan's town were so inspired by his example that they joined him and prepared to defend their town. With a Primarch leading the defense, the people of the town decisively defeated the Dark Eldar. Vulkan alone killed 100 Eldar that day. Within weeks, the leaders of the 7 largest towns on Nocturne had traveled to meet Vulkan, and they soon swore never again to hide from the raiders. In celebration of the Primarch's victory over the Eldar raiders, a tournament was decided to be held. Unexpectedly, a stranger arrived in the middle of the festivities. Of pale complexion and wearing outlandish clothing, the stranger asked only to be allowed to compete. When he announced that he could best anyone in the town, the people laughed at this outlander. Who could possibly beat Vulkan in any feat of intellect, strength, craftsmanship, or endurance? Nonetheless, Vulkan and the stranger wagered that whoever lost the tournament would forever serve the victor. Lasting 8 days, the contest included many tests of strength and endurance, such as the anvil lift, in which the 2 held anvils above their head for half a day before the contest was called a tie. The number of contests is unimportant, however, for by the end of day 8, Vulkan and the stranger were tied. In the final event, both contestants were given 24 hours to construct a weapon. before using said weapon to hunt down and slay the largest salamander they could find. Climbing a high mountain, the two each went out to find a drake. Vulkan quickly found and killed a very large fire drake. However, on his way back, the mountain he was standing on, which coincidentally was a volcano, erupted, casting Vulkan over a cliff. Hanging on for dear life over the precipice, Vulkan was determined to hang on to his massive salamander. Thus, he found himself hanging by one hand from a cliff, and his other hand clutching the tail of his drake. Hanging there for hours, Vulkan's strength eventually ebbed away until he knew he must decide between the drake and his life. At that moment, however, the stranger arrived, carrying his own drake. Even from the edge of the cliff, the Primarch could tell that the Outlander's drake was indeed bigger. Seeing Vulkan in distress, the stranger acted quickly, tossing his drake into a lava flow that separated them and using it as a bridge to cross to the Primarch. After hoisting Vulkan out of his mortal predicament, the stranger walked with him back to town, leaving his own drake to burn in the molten river of rock. Though the Outlander's drake had been superior in size, he had thrown it away to save Vulkan. And when he returned to the town, with the Primarch empty-handed, Vulkan was declared the victor. To the amazement of his people, however, Vulkan kneeled before the stranger and said that any man who would value life over pride was worthy of his service. At this moment, the Outlander cast off his illusionary disguise and revealed himself to be the Holy Emperor of humanity. It was thus that the Primarch, Vulkan, and his Emperor were reunited. During the Great Crusade, it is believed that at first, Vulkan did not become unified with his own legion for some years after his rediscovery, instead staying alongside the Emperor under his tutelage and fighting by his side. When Vulkan was eventually reunited with his legion, it was at the head of a fleet of 3,000 new recruits, which saved his forces from a massive orc horde. Eventually, it was decided that Vulkan's legion of Space Marines would henceforth be known as the Salamanders, in honor of the beast that united him with his father. The Primarch continued to serve loyally throughout the Great Crusade. At some point during the Great Crusade, Vulkan and his legion participated in reconquest of a world designated as 1546, or locally known as Karaton, together with the Night Lords led by the Primarch, Conrad Kurz, and the Mechanicum, Titan Legio Ignis, and several Imperial Army regiments. During this campaign, Vulkan became enraged at how Kurz and his legion waged war after he found out the Night Lords had killed the inhabitants of a whole city in order to seed fear amongst the population. This confrontation between Vulkan and Kurz resulted in a brief but fierce argument between the two Primarchs. After the conclusion of this campaign, Vulkan reported Kurz's behavior and actions to War Master Horus and Primarch Dorn of the Imperial Fists. However, during the battle against Karaton's ruling Eldar Coven, Vulkan flew into a rage when the Remembrancer ship, Seraph, was killed a surrendering Eldar child. This incident would haunt the Primarch deeply. On the world of 1544, Vulkan and his army came into contact with tribes of primitive humans living alongside Exodite Eldar. Surprisingly, the humans did not welcome the Imperial invaders. Vulkan was guided by her mysterious Remembrancer, later to be discovered as a psychic projection of the Emperor, to a webway portal. After a vicious battle to the portal, Vulkan came across human tribals preparing to sacrifice a Dark Eldar woman. The humans had learned to fear the Dark Eldar raiders and sought to sacrifice her to ward off their return now that the Exodites had been defeated. Moreover, Vulkan realized that the Dark Eldar woman was from the raiding parties that terrorized Nocturne in his youth, and these humans were descendants of Nocturne's captives liberated by the Eldar. Vulkan realized the Emperor had guided him here and understood that these humans would never accept the Imperium over their Eldar liberators, and he ordered the planet to be cleansed. He sought to erase any trace of human Xenos coexistence. Later, when Vulkan gave his protest to Horus, he sensed a great darkness within him. This caused Vulkan to neglect giving Horus the hammer, Dawnbringer. During the events of the Horus Heresy, Vulkan was present alongside Ferrus Manus and Corax at the Isfahan V Dropsite Massacre. During the battle, the majority of the Salamander's legion was killed by nuclear missiles fired from the Iron Warriors. Due to his perpetual regeneration abilities, Vulkan survived the explosion, but found himself surrounded by hundreds of warriors, the Iron Warriors, and Night Lords. Fighting to what he thought was his death, Vulkan was stabbed, shot, and bludgeoned in unconsciousness. Seeing a chance to torment his brother, Conrad Kurz took Vulkan prisoner. The Primarch of the Night Lords spent the next several months trying to break Vulkan's spirit and trying to kill him. Kurz personally cut off Vulkan's head, ripped at his throat with a fork, stabbed him to the chest, and tore him limb from limb. Separately, he had Vulkan eviscerated, shot with hundreds of bolters at close range, left in the venting shaft of a starship's engine, and even thrown into empty space, completely naked. Each time Vulkan died, his body would regenerate completely, leaving Kurz furious. Eventually, frustrated and bored with his inability to kill Vulkan, Kurz decided to get Vulkan to admit he was no less a monster than himself. Kurz had several Demonite priests ensnare Vulkan's mind and run him through trial after trial, ensuring he failed each time and innocents died. When Vulkan would not break, Kurz decided to end things in a duel. He made Vulkan navigate a maze designed by Perturabo, at the center of which lay Dawnbringer, Vulkan's personal hammer, as well as the corpses of several of his comrades. When Vulkan retrieved his hammer, he managed to overpower Kurz and activated a teleporter built into the head of the hammer. Vulkan was transported across the galaxy to the upper atmosphere of Macragge and burnt up during re-entry, confident he would wake up in the care of the Ultramarines. His charred body was later recovered by the Ultramarines, who at first were unable to identify the corpse as anything more than a grotesque statue. As all living matter, having burnt up on re-entry, over a series of days, Vulkan's body began to regenerate, eventually returning to life and shocking the Ultramarines apothecaries he had been entrusted to. Realizing who it was, the apothecaries summoned their Primarch, Rubute Gilliman, who was at first furious that no one could give him any answers as to how or why Vulkan had suddenly fallen from the skies. To Gilliman's horror, he found that Vulkan was broken mentally, violent and incoherent, attacking anything and everything he could. Unknown to everyone, a bond of sorts had formed between Kurz and Vulkan, the latter being able to sense when the Night Haunter was nearby. Kurz was indeed on Macragge, having been trapped aboard the Invincible Reason, but eventually breaking out of the Dark Angel's flagship and stealing a drop pod to the surface. Vulkan broke free of his bonds and pillaged Gilliman's private armory before setting off to hunt Kurz. The two fought across an entire city, Vulkan finally realizing his regenerative abilities and using them to his advantage. By focusing his will, he could regenerate much quicker. At one point, Kurz shot Vulkan's head off, causing the Primarch to fall from a cliff. Vulkan was back alive before he hit the ground. Their rolling duel was eventually stopped by the perpetual John Grammaticus, who had been in charge by the Cabal to permanently kill Vulkan with the Fulgurite, a petrified bolt of the Emperor's own psychic abilities. The Cabal had ordered Grammaticus to give the Fulgurite to Kurz, as only a Primarch could kill another Primarch, but before he could complete his mission, Eldrad Uthran of the Ulthway Eldar appeared to Grammaticus, convincing him that if he used the Fulgurite to kill Vulkan, he would give up his perpetual nature forever, but in exchange, completely restore Vulkan's mind. The presences and abilities of another Primarch in the Emperor's armies would tip the balance against Horus. Grammaticus then stabbed Vulkan through the heart, killing both of them in a psychic explosion. Grammaticus regenerated, as he always did, but was aware that this would be his last life, and Vulkan never recovered. Later, Vulkan's corpse was reclaimed by the Primarchs Gilliman, Lionel Johnson, and Sanguinius. Vulkan was placed in a stasis capsule, handcrafted by Gilliman himself, with the words "Unbound Flame" carved into the side. The few remaining salamanders who made it to Macragge were allowed to stand guard over their fallen Primarch until such a time as he could be returned to Nocturne. During their vigil, the salamanders thought they had heard a heartbeat coming from the casket, but dismissed it, convinced he could be resurrected. An expedition back to Nocturne, led by Artellus Numan, eventually was able to bring Vulkan's body back to Nocturne, and with Numion as the final sacrifice, Vulkan was restored from the Unbound Flame at Mount Deathfire. Upon his resurrection, Vulkan was in a condition similar to a fugue state and remembered little. He found himself in the depths of Mount Deathfire, conversing with an old man calling himself Deathfire personified. The man urged Vulkan to travel back to Terra and lead the Primarch to two items that he had no memory of forging: the Thunder Hammer, or Dracul, and the Talisman of Seven Hammers. When Vulkan awoke, he was at the steps of Mount Deathfire and discovered by three of his legionaries, Atok Ebdimi, Barak Zytos, and Egan Gargo. Vulkan ordered the three to return in 3 days and forbade them to speak to anyone else that the Primarch had returned to Vulkan. When the three returned, now dubbed Vulkan's Drexward, or his personal guard, the Primarch used his talisman to open a webway portal deep below Nocturne. What followed next was an arduous journey through multiple webway tunnels and exits to reach Terra. Vulkan and his Drexward found themselves in a satellite realm of Kamara, battling Dark Eldar. They next found themselves with a fleet of Shedrak Medusan, still engaged in a guerrilla war against Horus. Vulkan found Medusan's fleet in the midst of the upheaval, with the cult of the Gorgon claiming that it had resurrected Ferris Menace. Upon meeting the supposed reborn Ferris, Vulkan discovered to be a little more than a mechanical puppet, with one of Ferris's metallic arms attached. Saddened that his brother would be ashamed so, Vulkan shattered the puppet with his hammer. Vulkan refused to take part in Medusan's war and bring the battle of the Argonaut chain, and left for Caldera. On Caldera, Vulkan was greeted by Eldar, who guided him to a new webway portal on the orders of Eldred Uthran. Inside the webway once more, Vulkan and the Drexward ventured upon Kalistar, long since abandoned since the war within the webway. In Kalistar, the companions were beset by demons, and Vulkan became enraged in a battle against the Great Unclean One, Aglabor. Using the Talisman of Seven Hammers, Vulkan was able to not only slay the demon, but give it a true death. Still beset by demonic hordes, the companions were saved by Eldrad, revealing himself to be the Old Man of Mount Deathfire. Revealing that the way to the Imperial Dungeon had been sealed by the Emperor, Eldrad opened up a new portal that took Vulkan and his warriors to the front of the Imperial Palace. Vulkan was reunited with a visibly relieved Rokal Dorn, but promptly led by Custodes to the Golden Throne to meet with the Emperor himself. The Emperor, now trapped on the throne, revealed that he had not only been expecting Vulkan, but had been guiding him this entire journey, and had been the force that compelled him to construct Dracul and the Talisman of Seven Hammers. The Emperor told Vulkan that the Primarch's purpose had always been intended for this moment, for he was designed to construct the Talisman and oversee its true purpose. The Emperor revealed that the Talisman was a weapon of unprecedented power, a dead man's switch that would consume all of Terra should Horus succeed in the coming struggle. It would be Vulkan's duty to press the switch that would destroy Terra, but deny the world to the powers of chaos. Vulkan was horrified by the prospect, but the Emperor told him that he must be the one to oversee the device, for the Primarch has always been the most hesitant to use the weapons he forges. With that, Vulkan installed the talisman to the Golden Throne and took up a position by the Eternity Gate, keeping his existence a secret, save for a select few during the Siege of Terra. Vulkan next saw action when Magnus the Red and a group of his 1,000 sons infiltrated the Imperial Dungeon to kill the Emperor. Vulkan blocked a lethal blow by Magnus's staff that had been intended for the Emperor's form on the Golden Throne, but quickly backed down and alongside their father bid Magnus to return to the Imperial's fold. Vulkan became disheartened when Magnus refused the offer to return to the Loyalists after the Emperor told him that he would have to purge his legion due to its rampant mutations. Vulkan himself admitted that he would have made the same choice as Magnus, but nonetheless again defended the Emperor against the Crimson King's assault. Vulkan and Magnus then engaged in a furious duel, but it was saved from a decapitating blow thanks to the sacrifice of Egan Gargo. Horrified by his son's death and taking up his Thunder Hammer, Vulkan wielded twin hammers to seemingly beat Magnus into submission. However, before a visibly despairing Vulkan could deliver the final blow to Magnus, his brother fully gave himself to the powers of chaos and vanished from the throne room, with Magnus now inside the Imperial Webway and enacting a psychic ritual to sap the Emperor's Emperor's remaining strength, Vulkan was dispatched by Malkador to put an end to his brother as the Eternity Gate itself was besieged. As he moved through the webway, he ignored Magnus's lies and goadings along the way. After journeying to the impossible city to the webway, Vulkan finally came before Magnus, again ignoring his brother's manipulations, including a vision of the burning of Prospero. The two came to blows. Initially in their battle, Vulkan seemed to hit nothing but smoke, and it became apparent he was swinging his hammer at smoke. The real Magnus was behind a psychic barrier, steeped in his own ritual to weaken the Emperor. Vulkan took advantage of this by smashing through the already stressed Magnus's barrier, forcing the Crimson King to try and kill Vulkan directly so that he may be allowed to complete his work. Magnus tried every method conceivable to kill his brother. He beheaded him with his khopesh, suffocated him by turning his lungs to amber, drained him of his blood, and immolated him with psychic fire. However, nothing worked, and each time, the perpetual Vulkan would regenerate and continue to hammer away at Magnus. Attrition took hold, and Magnus grew increasingly desperate. He entered Vulkan's mind as the noble he had once been, attempting to explain his actions. However, Vulkan had none of it, scolding Magnus for his arrogant and reckless use of sorcery that had turned him into a slave to chaos. In the webway, Vulkan stood above Magnus, ready to deliver the killing blow. However, he hesitated, despite the Emperor's own voice ordering the Salamander's Primarch to kill his brother. Magnus used this moment to unleash the spell he had been working on, undoing Vulkan at a genetic level in a desperate bid to finally kill him. As Vulkan crumbled apart, he nonetheless was able to swing his hammer, smashing off Magnus's head with Urtracool and banishing him into the warp. Later, Vulkan's regenerating form was seen slowly making it back to the palace's webway portal, Urtracool in hand. Vulkan eventually made it back to the throne room through the webway gate, only to be greeted with the news that the vengeful spirit had lowered its void shields and the Emperor himself was preparing to lead an assault on the vessel. However, Vulkan was told by his father that he would not take part in this last-ditch effort. Instead, he would look after the Golden Throne, as Malkador took his place on it in the Emperor's stead. Should the traitors breach the palace, Vulkan was instructed to activate the Talisman of Seven Hammers. Mere hours later, Vulkan met with Hellenius Person, John Grammaticus, and their group finally reached the palace. There, he learned from Akate of the prophecy that foretold Horus as the Dark King and the potential fifth Chaos God. At the end of the Horus Heresy, it is claimed Vulkan was one of the Primarchs to oppose the Codex Astartes. This, however, would not be for lack of courage or loyalty, but due to the crippling losses sustained at Isfahan V, where his legion was cut down in size to but a few. During the Great Scouring, he became furious at the tales of the horrors visited upon Terra's population by the Emperor's children, attempted to find and kill Fabius Bile. Sometime later, Vulkan chose to leave the Salamanders, claiming that, like Space Wolf's Primarch, Lehman Russ, he would return in the end times. This was the last anyone saw of Vulkan for the next 1500 years. 1500 years later, during the War of the Beast, Vulkan reappeared, single-handedly defending the imperial world of Caldera from a massive orc invasion. Though he died many times against the Greenskins, he would regenerate and appear again at the forefront. Vulkan's one-man war on Caldera was unveiled by the Inquisition, and Lord Commander of the Imperium, Corland, led an expedition to the world to recruit him for a counteroffensive against the mighty war boss known as the Beast. Vulkan was eventually discovered by the expedition, but refused to lead it until Caldera was saved. Citing a vow long ago he made to the world to never let it fall again to flame. With the aid of Imperial forces, Vulkan was able to save Caldera from destruction by destroying the attack moon, or a moon converted to be a massive orbital cannon construction generator. After saving Caldera, Vulkan returned to Terra with Corland. He took command of the frantic Imperium, scolding the High Lords for their squabblings and inefficiency, but stating he would not purge them for the sake of unity. He then proclaimed that he would lead the might of the Imperium to Ulanor, the home world of the Beast. Vulkan made clear that his return was temporary, for he was destined to reappear for another war at another time. Vulkan officially led the subsequent crusade to Lenore to find and slay the beast once and for all, but in truth left most of the details to Corland, who he gave his full support to. Instead, Vulkan tinkered with Doomtremor, his new hammer, and remained isolated in his chambers aboard the Fist Exemplar's battle barge. Alcazar remembered. Though this discouraged many at first, Vulkan leapt into the fray of battle directly when the Imperial forces reached the capital city of Ulanor, Gorkograd. Vulkan eventually led the final charge into the beast's massive temple Gargant and confronted the war boss directly. Realizing that Vulkan had always intended to fight the beast alone, and knowing he could do little in the fight, Corlin ordered an evacuation from the temple. As the two giants clashed, the 10-meter-high war boss revealed he spoke perfect Imperial Gothic, gloating that humanity was on its knees and he would be its end. When Vulkan tackled the war boss, they both fell into the temple Gargant's power generator, where the Primarch became imbued with massive amounts of Wa energies. Rather than be consumed by the energies that so many other men had, Vulkan had used his primal and savage essence to become one with it and launch one last attack, slapped Doomtremor into the beast's face, and detonated the generator, causing a chain reaction that shattered the temple Gargant and seemingly obliterating them both. Vulkan was presumed dead by the Imperium, and Corlin stated that his sacrifice would be forever remembered. However, the Salamanders still hunt for him in the 41st millennium. They believe that he will return to them after they have found all 9 of the artifacts of Vulkan. During his lifetime, Vulkan left prodigious philosophical writings, particularly those recorded in the Tome of Fire, a vast series of writings that, amongst other mundane teachings, are said to hold glimpses of the future and prophecies yet to be fulfilled. Yet, even the more mundane of his writings held profound lessons, many of which have gone to become the key tenets of the Promethean Creed, with one reading as such: "Ours is a violent calling, but as adherents to the Promethean Creed, we believe in the circle of fire. None can come back as they once were, but in death we return to the ash from whence we came, to be born anew. Our blood and bone bonded with the earth. Through fire, our remains made protean. Through fire and the reunion with earth do we experience rebirth. After death, after our duty is ended, we will give ourselves to these elements, and in so doing, become a part of them. This is the nature of the Circle of Fire." Like his other brother Primarchs, Vulkan was equipped with a unique set of wargear. Vulkan was equipped with many finely crafted weapons, built by his own hands. Most notable of these was the massive Thunderhammer, Dawnbringer, and the plasma pistol, the Furnace's Heart. Before forging Dawnbringer, Vulkan used the hammer Thunderhead. For protection, he wore the Baroque power armor known as the Draken Scale, which included the Gauntlet of the Forge and Kasari's Mantle, an impenetrable cloak made from a salamander on Nocturne. After his resurrection following the Battle of Nocturne, Vulkan wielded the hammer Urdrakul. 1,500 years later, during the War of the Beast, Vulkan wielded the hammer Doomtremor. Vulkan forged thousands of unique and dangerous artifacts in his time, but charged the first Forge Father, Tekel, with destroying them as he departed for Isstvan 5. He conceded to allow Tekel to spare 7, which were then locked away in the rot if Vulkan ever fell at Isstvan. These 7, along with the Gauntlets of the Forge and Kasara's Mantle worn by Vulkan at Isstvan, survived to become known as the 9 Artifacts of Vulkan and are still sought out today. This concludes the information regarding Vulkan. More in-depth information regarding him will be recorded at a later date. This is Librarian Elias, signing off.